Great. All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Darcy Dugan. I'm with the Alaska Ocean Observing System and the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, and I'm joining today from the traditional homeland of the Dena'ina people where I live in Anchorage. And I'm excited to introduce the fourth and final session of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Spring Discussion Series that's been hosted by the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network. And you see a lot of people that have joined the other sessions. And I want to start off by saying we really appreciate your interest and your curiosity and the commitment of this community to this issue. And we're glad to see you back today. And for those of you that are new, the network started in 2016 here in Alaska with the goal of trying to expand our understanding of ocean acidification, both the processes and the consequences, but also exploring opportunities for to look into mitigation and adaptation. And the network is made up of researchers, fishermen, shellfish and kelp growers, tribal members, coastal managers, educators, all of you. And we actually presented to the legislature earlier this week and noted that they too are part of this network because we are all working together on this. One of the primary objectives of the network is to bring together experts on what we know so far about ocean acidification in Alaska with people to whom those impacts matter. And so far, the sessions have covered regional conditions, species response as they pertain to mariculture and subsistence, species response with respect to commercial species. And then today, instead of focusing on impacts, we're going to be looking at solutions. And one of the questions that most often comes up in conversations on ocean acidification is, what can we do about this? So we will be addressing adaptation and mitigation today. So what are ways that we can slow down or stop this problem? What strategies are out there and how are they working? And how are some of them being employed in Alaska? So our structure is going to be similar to last time. We'll start with speakers in the first hour to learn about what some of these solutions are, and then we'll move into breakout groups so that we can get your thoughts and ideas on some of these. And we'll also have some additional time with some topic-specific experts in the breakout. So I want to start off again by thanking the executive committee of the network that's put a lot of thought into how to structure these sessions, and then introduce Molly Mayo, who is our facilitator and has been for the last for all of the series. She's from the Meridian Institute, and I will pass it off to you, Molly.
Thanks, Darcy, and welcome everyone. Great to see the turnouts today for the last in this series, for at least this spring series. I did post the executive committee members in the chat. It's great to see some of the members here, and just want to echo all the great work that committee has done to help shape this effort. We'll talk a little bit more about looking forward towards the end. Darcy's going to come back with a summary of some of the thinking, everything that's happened so far, and sort of looking forward a little bit at the end. So we'll leave some time for that. So let me start by just saying, for those that are less familiar with Zoom, you can right-click on your window and rename yourself. You right-click, there's a window that appears, you can click rename. And we welcome those of you who want to include your organizational affiliation or any other information that would help to introduce you to other colleagues on the line. And part of the reason we're doing that is that we will not do full introductions during the plenary session. We will allow time for introductions during the breakouts. So the first half, loosely first half of the Zoom today, we are going to be hearing, as Darcy said, from experts in the field, those who are working on adaptation, mitigation, and solutions in particular. And we'll do that in the form of presentations first. We're going to shake it up a little bit this time. We'll do a PowerPoint presentation at the beginning, and then we're going to have a bit of an exchange, sort of a conversation with our second set of presenters. So we'll introduce them as we get to that. Then the second half of the session today will be in breakouts. We'll do smaller groups, and you'll be given a selection, a choice to make about which group you would like to participate in. And also a little bit different this time is we're going to allow some presentations in the breakout sessions also. We see an opportunity to talk broadly about these solutions, The whole world is looking at solutions right now for those for us to be able to draw from, but we also want to think about it from the perspective of Alaska in particular. And that's how we want to use the breakout sessions today, really drill down on some of the most relevant discussions underway, research underway for Alaska. So we'll have some more discussion from the experts in the breakouts, and then some exchange with all of you involved. Many of you are also experts, and we want to be able to tap that in the breakout session. So we're looking forward to those conversations in the second half of the session today. So I'll move in then to an introduction to the speakers. Let me start with, as I said, there are going to be 3 presenters that we're going to hear from today in a slightly different structure. The first one that we'll hear from is Jessica Cross, who is with the NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Lab. She's a research oceanographer, and she's based in Seattle. She's a member also of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network's Executive Committee. Her current research focuses on carbon biogeochemistry and ocean acidification in the Arctic regions, especially along the Alaskan coast. The main goal here is to better understand how acidification processes interact with natural cycles, and eventually to detect impacts of ocean acidification in marine systems. She conducts her research across a variety of platforms, including ship-based measurements, moorings, and mobile autonomous platforms like gliders and drones, et cetera, through NOAA's Innovative Technology for Arctic Exploration Program. She also broadly participates in many activities around Arctic research through things, Ocean Carbon Biogeochemistry Program, the Pacific Arctic Group, and the Interagency Research Policy Committee Collaboration Team. So welcome to Jessica Cross, and thank you so much for giving us the intro presentation.
How's my screen share?
We're seeing, oh, there you go. Yeah, you just moved it over. It looks terrific.
Outstanding. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Molly said, my name's Jessica Cross. I'm sure I know a great many of you from the work that I've done in Alaska across the years. And as we have worked our way through this particular discussion series, we've talked a little bit about exposure to ocean acidification risk at the very beginning. The next 2 sections really focused on quantifying the ocean acidification risks that we might see across a variety of different settings. And then, today in this 4th session, we're heading towards, what can we do about it? Right? Like, this is the number one question that I get anytime that I show up to, a meeting with the public and people ask me like, yeah, we get it. Ocean acidification is a risk. What are we going to do about it? And we face really 2 challenges with trying to answer that question. First is that we don't have a good strategy for what ocean acidification mitigation actually looks like. And the second challenge that we face is that communities are really wanting to take local action. And that really requires localized information. So not only do we not have these grand strategies in place, like for techniques that might help us mitigate ocean acidification, but once we do get those, we have to really narrow them down to these place-based strategies for mitigation. And so those are kind of the 2 bits and pieces of push and pull, and why you don't hear us talk about mitigation and adaptation a lot. But that being said, given that it's the number one question, what can we do, is the number one question that we all get, we thought we would delve into what the state of the science is on that a little bit, and what that might look like in Alaska once we do start arrowing in towards the local piece here. So many of you have heard me talk about this climate resilience cycle before. This is a cycle that was developed through the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And, it follows the pattern, like I said, that we've already taken with the format of the discussion series that we've gone through so far. We explored what some of those ocean acidification hazards were. Then we moved into assessing risk. And now I'm here to tell you that, like, I'm here to talk about how to investigate options and prioritize and plan between those options. Like, what do those pieces of this climate resilience cycle look like? So if you see me give this talk before, I'm going to skip all of the stuff that I normally say at the beginning and head right into investigating our options. So generally, when we talk about mitigation and adaptation, those are really two different things, even though a lot of the times colloquially, we use those terms interchangeably. And that really stems from this idea that when we talk about mitigation, we're generally talking about risk mitigation. And sometimes risk mitigation can actually fall into that adaptation category. And sometimes it actually addresses the underlying cause of climate change. So when you hear the IPCC talk about mitigation, that's the kind of mitigation that they mean. Actions that actively reduce the stressors that are creating ocean acidification and creating some of the stresses that we see from climate change, like, for example, increased surface ocean temperatures. And so there's two key aspects to mitigation that we can think about. One of them is emissions reductions. So how do we stop emitting as much carbon to the atmosphere and sort of slow the rate of ocean acidification in the future? And then the second package of mitigation options is carbon removal. How do we get rid of the carbon that's already in the atmosphere and already in the ocean that's contributing to both current acidification and future acidification? After that, I'll talk a little bit about what adaptation strategies look like. In Alaska, at least as far as I have been a part of them, really these, when it comes to climate mitigation or when it comes to climate adaptation, these are really much more focused on building resilience. And accordingly, these are social and economic strategies that we can pull together rather than things like, you know, these very clear, like, industrial strategies that we can pull together that help communities support themselves. So here's sort of the justification that we get from thinking about both emissions reductions and carbon removal. So what I'm showing on this plot, this is from the IPCC, but sort of replotted by a group called UNEP. And what you see along the x-axis is time. And what you see along the y-axis is the annual amount of greenhouse gases that are pumped into the atmosphere every year. The yellow line on this chart indicates a business as usual emission scenario for how much carbon is going to be emitted into the atmosphere. And then this red line is essentially the cap on the number of emissions that we can have in order to meet our climate goals. So what's shown in shading in the background here, this green, brown, and blue bit, is the strategies that we can use to take that yellow line and pull it down to the red line as much as we can. So there's, like I said, there's three colors here, three colors. The first color is green, and that generally refers to conventional abatement technologies. And I want to emphasize that this is the biggest chunk of this plot. So this is things like shifting to renewable energy, finding more energy efficient ways to engage with industry that we already have, et cetera. The next color, the next shading in this plot is brown. Just like we know we need to move away from some sources of emissions, we also already know that it's going to be really difficult to move away from other sources of emissions. I certainly know that as an oceanographer, it's going to be really hard for us to get off diesel fuel for ships. And this is my job to figure out how to do that kind of stuff, right? That's a fossil fuel, that a source that it's really difficult to move away from. So in order to meet our climate goals, we know that we need to offset those brown emissions somehow. And that's what's shown in this blue wedge here that essentially appears below the x-axis. So these are net negative emissions. And it was acknowledged by the IPCC for the first time in SR 1.5, the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, that no matter what, we were going to need these negative emissions in the future. So we can't achieve all of our goals by emissions reductions alone. We know that we're going to need negative emissions in some sense. And more recently, the IPCC has acknowledged this little shaded wedge that you see in the lower right-hand corner of this plot. And that's the removal of legacy carbon from the atmosphere. So not only do we need to get to net neutral by using this blue shaded area to offset some of our stubborn emissions, we also need to be looking at this blue shaded wedge and thinking about how to get to net negative. So not just to net neutral, we have to go past that. We have to get to net negative. So I want to emphasize again that it is absolutely critical that we do both of these things hand in hand. We cannot rely solely on offsets. Like we can't just offset 100% of our carbon footprint right now and call it good. We have to have both emissions reductions and offsets in order to meet these climate goals. So the plot that I'm showing here on the right-hand side is essentially the number of scenarios, climate scenarios that the IPCC uses that rely on both CDR and on emissions reductions. And it's almost 100% in whatever category you're looking at, whether it's a low emissions release scenario where we're not emitting a lot of carbon at all, whether it's a high emission scenario, or whether it's a very high emission scenario. We know that no matter what, we have to have both of these techniques hand in hand to meet our carbon goals or to meet our climate goals. So what does that mean? What does that mean specifically for ocean acidification? Like that's a lot of really good generic climate change stuff, but we have to be able to go a little bit past that. And I know that many of you have seen me share these plots before. Darren Pilcher shared these plots in the first iteration of this workshop series. But what can emissions reductions actually do to make a difference for ocean acidification? So what I'm showing here in these two plots, again, is time represented on the x-axis. And then this is the percent of the year that is favorable for different species around Alaska. So this is essentially like your growing season or your ideal habitat time on the y-axis. So as these lines sort of trend downward, that's less and less ideal habitat time. And the different colors you see in shading here are the sensitivity of different life stages or different species according to the parameters of this particular study. So the graph on the left focuses on a high emission scenario, where the graph on the right focuses on a low emission scenario. And I don't really need you to get into much of the details of all of these individual wiggles, but what I want you to notice is that the beginning of these plots looks almost exactly the same. And that's because ocean acidification is a slow process, and as it takes time to reduce emissions. So even though, you know, one is a high scenario and one is the low scenario, in the near term, ocean acidification is going to look similar under both pathways. And it's really the end of this time series that we're able to affect with emissions reductions. So under this high emissions scenario, we start to lose ideal habitat time, even for the most resilient of the species and life stages that we look at when it comes to ocean acidification. Whereas in this more moderate emissions scenario, we don't lose any of that time. So we're really able to maintain the growing season under these reduced emissions scenarios. So reduced emissions can make a difference, at least in the long term, for ocean acidification. And again, thinking about the fact that this has to be very localized and place-based, you know, this was an average for the entire Bering Sea shelf that I showed on this slide. Now we can really arrow in and look specifically on, you know, certain subregions like Bristol Bay. And the take-home messages are exactly the same. Under this high emission scenario, you know, we see a real drop-off in the amount of growing season or ideal habitat time, even at this most resilient level in these high emission scenarios. Whereas, you know, again, we maintain 100% of that in this lower emission scenario. And that's how we really work hard to sort of build these strategies at the large level and arrow in down towards the local place-based products as much as we can. So that being said, actually getting to that 4.5 scenario is pretty difficult. The longer we wait to reduce our emissions, the less likely it is we're going to be able to head that emissions or head off that ocean acidification slowdown with emissions reductions. And we're going to have to rely on CDR to be able to attain those targets. And so this particular plot, again, is showing time on the x-axis and CO2 emissions on the y-axis. And these different colors indicate how fast we would have to reduce our emissions at different years. So here at the very beginning of the time series in the yellow, you saw this nice gradual slope where we could have sort of like gradually reduced our emissions. Whereas the more purple colors are the more recent years. And you can see that's a pretty sharp drop off, right? Like it's really difficult for us to achieve that sharp drop off in an ethical, sustainable way. So, you know, if the world relied on emissions reductions only right now, we would have to decrease our emissions reductions 14% every year starting today. Think about how hard that would be for you to do just as a private consumer, let alone large industries, right? Getting rid of 14% of your emissions is shutting off your heat, or it's getting rid of your car. Like that's really, really difficult to do, which explains sort of why we need CDR to be a second part of this portfolio in the background. So there are many, many different forms of CDR, and I'm not going to get into all of them today. You know, the ones that are most relevant for ocean acidification are CDR methods that rely on the oceans. There are definitely coastal CDR methods as well as terrestrial CDR methods. You may have heard a lot about direct air capture or new agricultural practices that can help sequester carbon in the soils of farms. But we're not going to talk about those today because today we're here to talk about ocean acidification mitigation. So when we think about carbon removal in the oceans, it's three primary pathways that we think about. The first one is ocean alkalinity enhancement, where we use minerals that we add to the ocean to store atmospheric carbon dioxide in the ocean as minerals or rocks. The second pathway is through biotic cultivation and sequestration, where we do essentially the same thing, but we're storing that atmospheric carbon dioxide in the ocean in the form of marine plants. And then the third method is more akin to a desalination plant, where we're going to remove carbon using electrochemistry or filters, and then, you know, essentially store that carbon in tanks or in geologic reservoirs, just like you would store salt that is stripped from ocean water. And so that's a little bit more of an engineered approach. All of these methods are in their infancy. Nobody is ready to deploy these anywhere. There are so many open questions to answer. It's a huge research project. You know, and I highlighted that in yellow because if you take away anything from this presentation, that's what I want you to understand. It's like, we are not ready for large scale implementation of these methods yet. Gigaton scale essentially refers to like deploying these methods at a really large scale. I'm not going to read all the text on this slide to you. It's there for you to peruse at your leisure, but I really want to emphasize that across all methods, we don't really understand the durability of the carbon that's removed, how long, you know, if we do actually manage to remove the carbon from the atmosphere, how long does it stay gone? How long does it stay stored in the ocean? We also don't understand very well how to measure or monitor that. We don't understand life cycle analysis, like how much carbon do we have to emit in order to remove 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we especially do not understand how to track ecosystem level impacts and potential co-benefits like mitigation of ocean acidification. So when it comes to implementing these CDR methods, just like with CO2 emissions, we can try to do this at the global scale. And so on this particular plot, what I'm showing is like, let's say we implemented CDR at the global scale, but we were trying to achieve a regional benefit. What kind of regional benefit could we achieve if the whole world started to chip in on CDR at the global scale? What kind of a difference would that make for ocean acidification? And so this particular paper is essentially showing that we have to achieve a lot of CDR very, very quickly in order to make a difference for ocean acidification. And that's summarized by this plot that I'm showing in the lower left. So again, time on the x-axis here, you know, the year 1800 to the year 2200. 100. And then the pH anomaly is here on the y-axis. So think of this as how much global ocean pH is declining over time. This is what acidification looks like. So in this blue scenario right here, if we implement CDR very fast, we're actually able to attain a level of a lower level of acidification, right? We don't dip down quite as much. Global pH doesn't dip down quite as much. Whereas, if we implement CDR later, like we really focus on emissions reductions right now and we implement CDR later, all we're really achieving with CDR is a bounce back from this minimum that's already going to happen anyway. Again, because ocean acidification is a slow process and emissions reductions is a slow process. So we have to be thinking about, the timescales for these various things. So global CDR must take place very, very fast. Essentially, we have to be scaling it very quickly to, industrial gigaton level scale between 2025 to 2050. It's already 2022. So really relying on, global CDR efforts to mitigate our local acidification problems in Alaska is going to be really challenging. If the world pulls it out, we may be able to see localized benefits in the Arctic and in Alaskan waters. And this paper goes through some more detail on what those benefits actually are, but it's unlikely that we're actually going to hit those goals. Instead, rather than thinking about, pushing this problem off on the world scale, really, again, thinking about these place-based strategies. What can we do right here at home that may help us mitigate local acidification, even if we're not making a huge difference to global CO2 levels in the atmosphere? So how can we reduce these risks on the local scale? I want to emphasize that I first heard about doing this from the United Fishermen of Alaska, from UFA. They came to me and said, "Hey, Jess, do these techniques actually work?" And I said, "Man, there's no way. Like, that just doesn't seem like it makes any sense at all." And they said, "Well, we think it might. Maybe you should go read about it." And the more I read about it, the more convinced I became that, yeah, maybe we could make a difference on the local scale. And so workshops like this, where we have this kind of two-way dialogue, are really essential for us to be able to actually come up with these mitigation solutions. So thank you all so much for, again, this two-way dialogue where you've done part of the work of educating me, and I'm really excited to work with you going forward on some of these options. So let's talk about two. One of them is kelp, seagrasses, and macroalgae. So there's some preliminary research out there that indicates that macroalgae farms might be able to, again, store this atmospheric CO2, store this ocean CO2 as marine plants, and that helps raise ocean pH or mitigate ocean acidification, reduce those ocean acidification risks. Kelp in particular might be very good at this because it grows very fast and draws a lot of carbon out of the water very quickly. But also, understanding the feedbacks between ocean circulation, where we might be diluting that effect as the kelp is growing, to also understanding space use conflicts. Understanding, hey, maybe we don't want to forest an entire bay with kelp if we're also trying to fish for crab there. We want to make sure that we're maximizing the use of these coasts in as sustainable a way as we possibly can. So there's a couple of ongoing studies, again, around the world, sponsored by Sea Grant and some of these other funds. But here's what some of that preliminary data looks like and why we're not really sure if this is going to work great yet. The only thing that I want you to notice about this plot, again, time on the x-axis, the amount of carbon that's been removed from the water on the y-axis. The only thing that I want you to notice about this is that it's very, very noisy. The plot is very noisy. So how do we know, based on noisy data like this, exactly how much carbon has been removed from the ocean versus the atmosphere? It's kind of hard to tell based on the observing tools that we already use right now. So remember when I said we wanted to try and balance, the growth of kelp versus the amount of ocean circulation? It turns out that at this particular study site, there was a ton of flushing or a ton of tidal circulation. And that really dilutes the signal over time and creates a lot of this noise that you see in the background right here. So if we can install some of these projects in areas that have less of that, maybe we'll actually be able to track the impact of CDR and the amount of carbon that is removed, but it's difficult. And that's why we're not necessarily ready to just jump the gun and put it right in the water right now. Another one of the methods that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is ocean alkalinity enhancement, where again, we're storing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or sucking it up from ocean water and storing it as rocks. So this is, again, a plot from a study that Dr. Hongxi Wang from the University of Rhode Island will be talking about in one of our breakout rooms later. And she ran a modeling study that essentially estimated, if we had a reasonably sized ocean alkalinity enhancement plant, where we were, sloughing off a lot of this alkaline material into ocean water right at Unimak Pass, what would be the implications for ocean acidification? And she'll talk in more detail about that study, but she essentially found benefits might be limited if you're only relying on this one site. And there are a lot of open questions that we have to answer before we are anywhere close to ready to building a plant to add alkalinity at Unimak Pass. We're not anywhere close to actually implementing this yet. So this was just a theoretical study. But Hongxi is going to talk more about that in one of our breakout rooms. And if you're curious to hear more about that, I encourage you to join that room. I should have said when we were talking about kelp earlier, Jordan Hollersmith, the macroalgae lead for the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, is going to be in another breakout room. And if you have more interest in talking about kelp and macroalgae for CDR, you can join Jordan's breakout room. But before we head into breakouts and talk really specifically about what those local impacts of acidification might be, let's take a minute to step away from mitigation and talk about adaptation. So adaptation is all about hey, let's say we don't do anything about climate change or ocean acidification. We're not trying to reduce our emissions. We're not trying to remove CO2 from ocean water. We're just going to deal with it. What can we do? What are the adaptations that our communities can put in place? And one of the best things that we can do is monitor the water that's being brought into aquaculture facilities and hatcheries to make sure that we have the opportunity to see when heavily acidified water might be flushing those tanks and killing oyster larvae. That was something that actually happened in the wild in the Pacific Northwest. And there's been a lot of strategies that have been developed for the aquaculture industry to essentially not pump acidified water into your hatchery. So we have monitoring systems that can be put in place right now that help us adapt to those conditions, adapt our industrial practices or our aquaculture practices to the conditions that currently exist without trying to change those conditions. But really the number one thing that you can do in order to reduce the risk that your community faces and adapt to climate change without actually trying to change emissions in the atmosphere or change the level of acidity in the water is join a coastal acidification network. That's where you're talking to your neighbors about where what conditions might be like in your backyard. You can join a community sampling program, for example. And really be talking about how do we work together as communities in order to understand what the impacts are going to be on our communities. How can we better establish food security that relies on maybe non-threatened sources? How do we protect the cultural assets that we have best? That's what coastal acidification networks are for. Those are the networks that are hosting these research workshops right now. And they work. These local sampling programs have been scaled all around the state. And there's a lot of research out there that talks about how communities and specifically Native tribes are really taking the lead on climate adaptation and planning for climate change. So I want to emphasize, it sounds, a lot less satisfying than the engineered solutions for mitigation that I talked about before, but these social networks work. Certainly that's something that I've learned directly from tribes and communities across Alaska. That is something that you've taught me. And so I certainly don't want to be, suggesting to you that is the best solution. That's something that I've learned directly from you. The other advantage of joining one of these coastal acidification networks is, again, you get access to data, you get notified of workshops like this so that you're just better educated and understand what the risks are, which helps you to plan. So that really concludes my remarks for the day. I wouldn't be able to study any of these off the wall techniques if I didn't have people that were keeping the wheels on the bus for me here at home. That includes Darren Pilcher, who's the modeling lead that I work with and who you heard from earlier in this workshop series. Abatement Sidden, who helps us understand how to plug our modeling products and observation projects for ocean acidification into fisheries management practices. Hongxi Wang at the University of Rhode Island, who's a close collaborator, Esther Kennedy at the University of California, Davis, who's a close collaborator, and of course, Natalie Minacci at the Ocean Acidification Research Center. That's really the clearinghouse and the infrastructure that we use to bring all of this information to you. And with that, I will tidy up my remarks and hand the floor back to Molly.
Jessica, wow, thanks. Thanks so much. That was a fantastic overview, a lot of information packed into a short period of time. And I just want to put a big shout out to those of you who are sharing additional information, responding to Jessica's, some of her points in the chat. It was terrific to share some additional resources, other activities that are going on, and I encourage you to continue doing that. Also, if there are questions that you have after Jessica's presentation that you want to potentially address in some of the breakout conversations, feel free to add that also, and we'll try to track that and carry it into some of those breakouts. I'm just so impressed with the way, Jessica, you were able to frame up such a wide range of issues, and including the fact that we're not looking for a silver bullet. We're exploring lots of different options. So I'm going to ask Darcy to remove Jessica's spotlight, and I'm going to tee up the next session, which builds very much on some of what Jessica was describing at the very outset of her presentation, which is that emission reduction is a critical element to anything that we do in terms of the research and innovation to help to search for climate mitigation alternatives. That we also need to look for options to help us to decrease the total emissions that we are contributing to the problem. And when we think about that piece of the puzzle, which I think Jessica did a great job of describing this as a puzzle, we have to think about all these different pieces. And when we think about the challenge of reducing our emissions, no one, we all recognize that we have to think about policy tools also, that is a key piece of the solution. And so even though the OA discussion series has been focused heavily on the science and research underway to help us to address the ocean acidification challenges, we felt it was really important to make sure that we are bringing in a discussion of the policy alternatives also that complement the research that we're doing into the science and natural system solutions that exist that we can continue to explore. So we think about this all as an integrated approach to, driving towards better outcomes and solutions. So to help us with that policy piece today, we're taking a slightly different approach to the second set of speakers, and we have invited two to join us today. I'll introduce them both here at the outset, and they are going to talk with us about sort of what we're seeing in this policy landscape as we think about the options and solutions that complement the science and innovation that we're seeing, the technology and science innovation that will help us. The first is Dorothy Childers, and Dorothy is a name now that you've heard several times. She is active in the OA network and has been active in the marine conservation space in Alaska for quite some time. We're really excited to have her here. She's a member of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network's executive committee, has been very instrumental in helping to shape this series. And she co-produced The Future Ocean, which is an informational podcast that discusses with experts what is happening in the ocean and explores some of these policy options that we're going to just touch on lightly today. They talk about how they work, what the terms mean, what kind of action is happening regionally and nationally, and they dive deeply into two policy options that help to decrease carbon emissions, which is carbon pricing and cap and trade. So the Future Ocean was produced in 2021. It's a project of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, and I'll put a link to that podcast in the chat as soon as we kick things off here with Dorothy. Secondly, we are very excited to welcome Chris Rose, who is the director of the Renewable Energy Alaska Project, or REAP. Often many people refer to it as REAP. And he has worked on many levels throughout the region and Alaska, driving initiatives to reduce emissions, reduce energy demand, and advance clean energy alternatives. He's been very instrumental in raising the profile of these issues and helping to advance solutions throughout Alaska that will help us to address some of these, or create, I should say, opportunities for some of these solutions to materialize in Alaska. And then I'd add that it's really about creating sort of the enabling environment for us to be able to advance policy solutions while we're also investigating some of these scientific and technological opportunities to mitigate carbon challenges. So I'm very excited to kick things off with, I believe Dorothy is going to start with us. And Dorothy, just as a calibration, you have about 15 to 20 minutes to work with. And I'll put a plug in that we will have an opportunity to continue talking with Chris and Dorothy in one of the breakout sessions. That will be one of the choices everyone will have. So I'll give you a little warning when you just have a few minutes left, Dorothy, just so to help manage the time. But I think I can turn it to you to kick things off for us, if I understand.
Okay, thank you so much, Molly, and thank you everybody for who's here today. I'm going to try to cut my talk a little bit short so we can make sure we hear from Chris also in this plenary, and then we can hear more from Chris in the breakout. I think, we've had a lot of discussion already about the importance of reducing emissions, reducing new emissions, and how big of a factor that is in whether or not we reach the IPCC's recommendation for emissions reduction by 2050. So let's just start with, how we do that. I think, we know that carbon emissions occur throughout our economy. That is, the power or electricity generation sector, transportation, agriculture, industrial activities like manufacturing and heating and cooling buildings. And the IPCC has shown us that the faster we can decarbonize these systems, the better chance we have. And I think Jessica's graphs showing how the IPCC's low carbon emission scenario dramatically reduces the trajectory for acidification later in this century is very important. So it really shows that it matters what we do now, because it's going to have a huge effect on what happens later. And we need to take action that reduces emissions on a big scale and across the whole economy. Most of us probably do lots of things in our own lives to, say, reduce our household carbon footprints, but public policy is how we bring this to scale, because the economy is large and complex. So even though it matters what we do in our own lives, it also matters what happens on a larger scale. Even though the economy is large and complex, it can be responsive if given the right signals to decarbonize. So we need to do this in ways that achieve those goals, but also meet societal and community interests in terms of fairness and in ways that generate well-being in various ways. That's really important. So let's just go to a summary of the kind of policy approaches on the table that decision makers are wrestling with right now. It's important to note that analysts who look at these things all agree that there's no silver bullet, just like there's no silver bullet in the carbon dioxide removal space either. So there's no one thing we can do to make this all better. And the IPCC really emphasizes that in their recent report on mitigating climate change. They have one take-home message that we need a combination of policies and approaches that cover the scope of the challenge. And they're looking at the problem globally. So different solutions are more workable or less workable depending on the country, their economic situation, the stability of their institutions, their capacity to implement things, their access to technology and all of that. So, but I'm just going to focus more on the US and how the discussion has been unfolding here. It's happening at the state level, it's happening in our own communities, it's happening in Juneau right now, it's happening in Washington, DC. And it's happening at many state levels as well. So these would be regulatory approaches, economic or financial tools, and then there's market-based systems. For regulatory approaches, that means the government has is regulating emissions, or the government policies are regulating emissions as they occur throughout our economy. Examples of these are, say, a simple one, mileage standards for cars that automakers have to meet. We've had those for a long time, and they aren't super stringent, but we've had them. And what if we didn't have them? You know, it would have been way worse. So that's an example of a regulatory approach. President Obama's Clean Power Plan was a large regulatory approach to reduce emissions in the utility sector. It never actually went into effect, but it turns out that the utilities have reduced emissions on their own and ahead of the Clean Power Plan schedule anyway. So we see emissions reduction is making economic sense, and that's, of course, extremely encouraging. Another example of regulation is, and there are a number of states that have policies stipulating how much power must be generated with renewable energy and on what timeline. Many of them aren't nearly ambitious enough, but they are important and nevertheless. And Chris is going to talk to us later about what's happening in the Alaska State Legislature on that front. The next approach I wanted to kind of summarize is economic or financial measures that can be taken. There are a lot of examples of these. In the, you remember the Build Back Better bill, which failed in Congress earlier this year, but it included a series of tax credits for a number of things, and such as development of tax credits for the development of wind, solar, and battery storage, tax credits for the development of hydrogen fuel for hard to decarbonize activities like aviation or shipping, as Jessica talked about, or trucking. So, and some of those tax credit ideas will probably come back in a future legislation. The Build Back Better also had investments in helping utilities in low income areas to support their transition to clean energy. It had grants and ways to leverage private capital for the development of zero carbon technologies. It had a lot of things. Chris is going to talk to you later about a special financing mechanism under discussion here called the Green Bank. He can talk about that later. And then the infrastructure bill that did pass contains a number of provisions, policy provisions that invest federal funds in specific things like research and development and carbon sequestration, carbon dioxide removal, like what Jessica was presenting, making the electric grid more reliable with wind and solar power generation, setting up electric vehicle charging stations and so forth. There's another very new financial tool at the federal level at the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the agency that basically regulates Wall Street. And they have a draft rule requiring that publicly traded corporations disclose their greenhouse gas emissions or their climate risk to investors. So this one does not result in emissions reduction directly, but it does inform investors in ways that may incentivize a corporation to achieve a lower carbon operation to make themselves more competitive. This rule isn't final yet, and I'm not sure when it's scheduled to be finalized, but it would be another tool to bring pressure to bear on certain economic activity across the country. And then lastly, there are market-based approaches. These include various forms of putting a price on carbon emissions and allowing the market to drive decarbonization. I wanted to spend a bit more time on this. I'm not sure I have it, but it's probably the tool that most people know the least about. So I'll maybe just sort of go over the basic premise behind it and won't get into too much detail about the specific examples. But the basic idea behind pricing carbon emissions is this. Right now, there are lots of social costs associated with our use of fossil fuels that come in many forms. So if you live in a neighborhood adjacent to refineries, or you work in a coal mine, for example, you're exposed to a lot more toxic pollution and you bear the associated health effects. But these costs are not accounted for in the price that we pay for oil, gas, and coal. In Alaska, maybe the cost to us is the consequences of warming and acidification on our fisheries or our subsistence resources, or the loss of sea ice and risk to coastal communities from storm surges. You know, the list goes on and on, but economists and the federal government even has this in regulation. They call this the social cost of carbon. And the idea is to account for the social cost of carbon by putting a price on carbon emissions to reflect that social cost. Of course, assigning a dollar value to the social cost of carbon is, you know, from my way of seeing the world, is pretty impossible, since the consequences of acidification and climate change are so incredibly far-reaching. And much of what's at risk has high value to us, but it doesn't convert well into monetary terms. So, you know, how much is a productive ocean worth, or a river full of salmon for future generations of Alaskans? We have a hard time putting a dollar value on that. But putting a price on carbon emissions is a way to make emissions more expensive in order to incentivize driving emissions down. And putting a price on carbon can come in different forms. The most obvious is a carbon tax, or sometimes it's called a carbon fee. And it's pretty straightforward. It's a steadily rising fee per ton of carbon emissions, and it's charged to the producer of oil, gas, and coal at their site. And it's based on their carbon intensity. So the tax on coal is higher than the tax on natural gas, for example. And this makes fuels more expensive, and that cost then trickles down to you and me. And the higher the fee, the more incentive to take for all of us to take bigger steps in emissions reduction. So if you're a utility and you are paying higher price for coal or oil or natural gas because of this tax, then it's an incentive to make that transition faster to renewables, because then you're making cheaper energy for your customers. And there are other forms of this, which I don't think I have time to go into, but I will say that Canada has a carbon tax, and the state of California and the state of Washington both have what are called cap and trade programs, which are a different way to price carbon. And Europe has an emissions trading system as well that has a price. So you might be thinking, I don't want to pay more for oil and gas. So what can we do about that? Why should we be the ones to bear the brunt of this pricing systems? So I think what's important is that there's a commonality between all these pricing systems, and that is that they generate huge revenue. And this revenue can be spent in many ways. It can be returned to households to ease the burden of the increased cost of fossil fuel in our economy. And this is called a fee and dividend plan, and there are bills in Congress for this. So when your cost of fuel goes up for you because of this carbon price, you also would then get kind of a rebate to cover the burden that you bear as a household for that the time it takes to transition to clean energy and cheaper energy. So it's just a way for households to adapt and to make the transition easier for society. Revenue can be spent on renewable energy or clean transportation systems. That's what Washington State and California have done a lot. It can be distributed in different ways to address inequities and how climate or acidification are affecting people. There's a lot of ways to do it, and that's all in the design. So to wrap up, I just wanted to say that we need to use multiple tools, because there's no silver bullet that can do it all, and a combination will be most effective given that we're on a rapid schedule to decarbonize. And that means regulatory measures, economic and financial measures, market-based measures, all of these things that, or the market-based measures that put a price on carbon emissions. All of these things can work together. And the IPC says that we need to do all of that. They also say that we need to design these measures taking into account existing uses of the land and water, such that the burden doesn't fall on vulnerable people or on communities. And I think Jessica spoke to that a bit. And we can do more by looking for ways to enhance the co-benefits of decarbonizing the economy. So at the same time that we're reducing emissions, we also are improving air quality and health and maintaining or storing, maintaining habitats that restore or sequester carbon. And we're engaging people in the way forward in doing all this. So the solutions, I think we would all agree, will be much more successful and far more durable if more people are engaged in making a low carbon future. And that's why I'm so happy to talk to you, because the more we are talking together, the more engaged you can be in talking to decision makers about what you think is a good way forward. And so now I assume Chris is here.
Yep, I'm right here.
Okay, Molly, do we have time to ask Chris a few questions?
Yep, and I'm going to, let's see, we'll pull Chris up, add a spotlight. So we've got both of you spotlighted. And why don't we agree that we'll take about 10 minutes. So we'll shift to breakouts a little bit later. And hopefully, Chris, you can stay long enough to be able to bridge over into the breakout also, and we'll continue the conversation there. But we'll use about 10 minutes right now. How does that sound?
Sounds
okay,
good.
Great. Oh, that's great. Thanks. Okay, so I just have a few questions for Chris. I thought I could help him kind of focus on what's happening in Alaska. He's really a leader in all the renewable energy and energy efficiency work happening throughout the state. There's a lot of people doing a lot of wonderful things, and Chris is one of them. So I just wanted to ask you, Chris, how have policies advanced in toward clean energy in Alaska over the time that you've been working on this? What does that look like?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, thanks for inviting me, Dorothy, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. One of the things that I've talked about in the past is the difference between policy and programs and projects. And sometimes those are conflated. I would say that in Alaska, particularly in the work that I've done over the last 15, 18 years, we've been able to successfully get several excellent programs developed here in the state, but I think we're still working on policy. The closest thing we've had to a real policy breakthrough is a bill that got passed 2 years ago that, for the first time after 40 years of trying, requires the rail belt utilities to work together and to plan together and to have regional standards, which is really laying the groundwork for some other policy options that we're working on right now. But for instance, some people will say a renewable energy policy is build Susitna-Watana. That's one project, and it's clearly not a policy. It's the tail wagging the dog. So I usually in presentations will show a pyramid where policy is at the top. Out of that flows programs like the Renewable Energy Fund, which we got established back in 2008, or the weatherization programs that we helped fund that were so successful, and then all the way down to the projects that flow out of those programs. So just giving people a sense of how things align and the hierarchy of them is also pretty important. I also want to touch on one of the things you said earlier about all these tools and different approaches, because that is so important. None of us can do everything, but almost all of us can do something. And one of the things that I think Alaskans overlook sometimes is this incredible opportunity for us to impact what goes on with our energy systems through the cooperatives, the electric cooperatives that we are all members of. First of all, people don't realize we're members of cooperatives. Some people just think we're paying a bill to some utility company. Well, it's not an investor-owned utility. If you're in the rail belt, you're typically paying to one of four co-ops or the city of Seward. They're all public utilities. The reason that's important is, number one, 80% of all the people and about 80% of all the electricity is produced in the rail belt. So it really has an impact on the whole state. And secondly, as maybe some of you already talked about in previous sessions, everything's moving toward electricity. Yesterday and today, Alaska Center for Energy and Power put on a 2-day workshop called Electrify Everything. There's a panel of the exact same name coming up at a conference later this month. We're going to electrify transportation. We're going to electrify heat. And if we can use renewable energy to do all of that and push our local utilities through co-op board elections and so on, we actually can do a lot here without even touching the state legislature. So I just want to point that out, and happy to talk about some of the policies that are actually in progress in Juneau right now. if we have time.
Okay, but so to the degree that policies and programs are that I conflated them, I think it would be helpful if people understood that we've already made some progress.
Yeah, and I certainly didn't mean to say, Dorothy, you've conflated them. I think everybody conflates them. I mean, I hear people all the time talk about how the fact that we've got a renewable energy grant fund, that's a policy. Well, that's actually not a policy, it's a program. We established the Renewable Energy Grant Fund back in 2008. The state of Alaska has appropriated $275 million to that program. That's matched. It's been matched with federal and state money, about another $300 million. We've been able then to build $600 million worth of projects, leveraging that state money. That's done things like reconnaissance and feasibility studies, but it's also actually constructed about 80 or 90 renewable energy projects in the state of Alaska, mostly in rural Alaska, where the energy burden is the highest. The other, I think, really fascinating and cool thing about that is we in the process have become world leaders in integrating renewables on small diesel grids, which is important because we have about 50 or 60,000 people here are relying on diesel in our remote communities. But actually there are probably close to 800 or 900 million, if not a billion people on the planet who are also relying on diesel, who could use the technology that we could transfer to them that is being really facilitated by the Renewable Energy Grant Fund that got passed in Alaska in 2008. I mentioned the weatherization programs. They were actually in place before REAP started, but we were able to help get massive amounts of appropriations into them, $640 million, which enabled more than 50,000 homes to weatherize. That's, according to HFC, who runs those programs, displacing about 35 million gallons of heating oil equivalent every year. The Renewable Energy Grant Fund's doing the same. So just those two programs are displacing the equivalent of 60 or 70 million gallons of oil every year. And that's cumulative every year, keeps on going. So those are great programs. And I could go on, there's a lot of other ones. Policy is a little bit different because it really requires a thought process that incorporates how Alaskans are going to produce and consume energy affordably. Some people would say, well, we got an oil and gas policy. We're producing oil and gas. That's not a policy. It's an economic driver. It's an economic development program because actually we don't get any hometown discount. We're paying some of the highest energy costs in the United States. The rail belt's paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. The average in the country is less than 14 cents a kilowatt hour. We all know it's much, much, much higher in remote communities. In fact, I'm really concerned about how remote communities are even going to survive with what we're hearing about $14 and $15 heating oil prices this fall. That's just unbelievable to think about how a community or an individual family is going to pay that. So the policy that we're working on right now in the legislature is now called the Clean Energy Standard. It started out as a renewable portfolio standard, but the latest committee substitute that came out last week is a clean energy standard. It would require 80% of the electricity in the rail belt to be produced by 2050 from clean energy. Now that was a change too. We originally got a bill introduced by the governor that would have said 80% by 2040, but the fact that the bill's got traction and that it's probably going to get out of its second committee this week is exciting. We probably won't pass it this year because we're going to run out of time, but I think it's showing that there's an appetite and an interest in diversifying our portfolio, number one, and getting off our almost addiction to cooking like gas, which is super high priced, but also just considering all the other benefits that are going to come with that, including potential research and development to things like tidal, certainly jobs, and keeping hundreds of millions of dollars in our economy every year. So that standard would actually be enforced by a fine on utilities that don't make the standard. So that's what I mean by policy, something that actually has some teeth. And that's what we're working to establish right now in the state, at least for the rail belt.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I don't know, Molly, how are we doing?
If this is a nice segue, I think it'd be terrific to be able to carry this conversation over into the breakout. Maybe Dorothy, if you have any closing comments or anything like that, we can wrap this portion up and then we'll shift over to the breakout discussion.
No, I don't. I think we're good. I just hope we can have in the breakout we'll hear more from Chris, and it would be nice to have some discussion with him about, questions that you might have or thoughts you might have about how we're doing in Alaska.
That's great. And Chris, yeah, it's terrific to be prepared. I think that you guys have teed this up just perfectly to both give us a sense of the landscape at the national level and also Alaska, a little bit of a teaser. This goes for all three of the breakouts that I'll introduce here now in just a moment, is that our goal is to now take these concepts that we've introduced at a high level that apply throughout the world in terms of some of the opportunities and solutions, really focusing on solutions that are starting to materialize and that we're trying to better understand on a global basis, and really drill that down into an Alaska-centric focus. What is most relevant to Alaska, and what are we seeing in that landscape emerging in Alaska? And we're doing it, our hope is to do this in a way where all of you, everyone on the line, really feels like they're empowered to be able to help to drive some of these solutions as we look forward, and hopefully try to mitigate some of the potential impacts of ocean acidification, not just adapt to them, which we've focused on significantly already, trying to understand how both our people and our species, the fish and others are responding to ocean acidification impacts. So let me, I'll give Darcy just a warning that we'll post the breakouts here. And everyone will have the opportunity to select which group you'd like to go into. And so building from these two conversations, we have three choices that we're offering. The first one is building on the conversation you just saw. We'll focus on Alaska carbon policy, the landscape, efforts to decrease carbon emissions, and accelerate renewable energy alternatives in Alaska. Chris Rose, Dorothy Childers, and myself will be in that group. The second one will focus on kelp and carbon sequestration and natural climate solutions for OA mitigation. Jordan Hollersmith and Darcy Dugan and Esther Kennedy will be in that group leading that discussion, with a real focus on the technologies and research, et cetera, underway that is particularly relevant to some of Alaska's opportunities using kelp and in general, but generally looking at carbon sequestration. And then breakout session 3 will focus on ocean alkalinity enhancement and carbon dioxide removal more generally as an OA climate mitigation option. Hanji Wang and Darren Pilcher will be leading that discussion, with Jessica Cross helping to facilitate. And so you have 3 options. We'll go ahead and post those now, and you can self-select. And if you do, there's one note that I got that said, can I hop around? And we can do our best to help make that happen if needed. But ideally, I think focus on one of those topics to allow you to dive more deeply into it. So on your screen, you should see a window appearing right now. If you don't, please go to the bottom of the screen and click on Breakout Rooms. And you can select under your name, you can select which of the 3 options you would like to choose. If you scroll to the bottom, so I'm just wondering, I think we're going to cut short some of the reports from the sessions. Dorothy, would you mind just giving a quick snippet of what happened in the policy session, and the other two sessions? Be prepared to just do a really quick highlight. I don't think we have time to recap everything that we discussed, but Dorothy, can I put you on the spot if you'd like to?
Sure. So Chris Rose gave a kind of an introduction and summary of 2 bills in the legislature that he's working on: a renewable energy standard bill and a green bank bill. But more important about what Chris offers is just a lot of context and a lot of detail about how these things work and why they work, and why they, how they're useful to rural Alaska and urban Alaska both. And he also talked about all the ways that Alaska can be a leader in the research and development and transfer of renewable technology that works in rural and isolated places. And then we had a short discussion, or an intermittent discussion, I guess, about how people about, you know, the ways that people and communities can be supportive of all that. But I don't know if I got that right.
That's terrific. That's great. So let me turn next to, well, anything to add from that group? Anyone want to chime in with anything critical? Okay, I'll turn then to Esther and Darcy. Oh, whoops, I think it was Hannah and Darcy.
Sure. Hannah, do you, I guess, just very broad overview, there were some really good questions, remaining questions about kelp that we Q&A at the beginning of ours. We had quite a bit of expertise in our group. I guess one of the comments was that there's a lot of enthusiasm for kelp in Alaska, but do we have it? Could we scale it up in Alaska in a way that could actually move the needle on climate change? The answer there is this is drop in the bucket, but we there's more to explore as far as local impacts, and we're still not sure about the benefits at the local level. But I think a lot of opportunities to further communicate between the kelp growing community and the research community. And we opened up our mural within like the last 6 minutes, and people added a bunch of stickies, and I actually haven't even gotten a chance to read them all. But if you look at our slider about how people, our slider across the top was how optimistic people felt about the role of kelp. And I would say there was a wide spectrum of how the level of optimism, but realizing that kelp, even if it is not going to be the silver bullet for ocean acidification, also has a lot of other benefits and a lot of momentum in Alaska, and a lot of remaining questions to be answered.
Thanks, Darcy. How about Esther and Jessica?
Our group had a really excellent presentation by Hongji about study on ocean alkalinity enhancement in the Bering Sea. And then we had a really nice, long and fruitful question and answer session focusing on how ocean alkalinity enhancement actually works. What did we learn from that study in terms of its applicability to things like the king crab fishery and other fisheries in the region? What do we still not know about alkalinity enhancement in the Bering Sea, and how much does it, as I think Darcy was saying, is this a metric by which we could like move the needle on climate change, or is it a local phenomenon? And then we were just getting started with introductions, and we ended up back here. So really, if you have a chance to check out our mural, lots and lots of info in the question and answer, and we had a pretty quick amount of time to then get into what people are excited about or concerned about specifically with OAE. Jess, do you want to add anything?
Outstanding summary.
I see that your little gauging the emotion, you also had a bit of a range, but leaning towards the excitement. And I will say that at least on the carbon policy front, those who did it really decisively enthusiastic or excited about the opportunities on the policy program and initiative front. So promising opportunities. So here's a poll from Darcy. So let me turn to you, Darcy, to introduce the poll, and also give us just a reflect back on what we've accomplished over the spring.
Sure, and I'll make this quick because I know it's almost 3. I just want to really thank everybody. This series has been successful because of your participation. When we were thinking about the vision for the series, you were the ones that provided the input to help identify where the conversations were needed, and your thoughts and ideas over the past 8 weeks and your interest and your curiosity here have really helped move the discussion forward. So we will be taking what we heard and learned through the presentations and the breakouts to help guide the next phase of the Ocean Acidification Network. And we'll be producing a report that summarizes what was discussed. All the presentations will live on the OA Network website. And we're also going to be circulating a survey so we can hear from you about what aspects were useful, what might be changed. Is there interest in a future series, and what topics that you would want to hear about? So we hope that you come away with this with some wind in your sails. We know this issue is a tough one. It's often feels a little depressing, but there is a big commitment from Alaskans to address it. And I think there's momentum here in this virtual room. There's a building body of knowledge, and there's also a lot of room for creativity. So in my closing, I'm going to just quickly share a slide to thank the speakers from the past 4 sessions. I also want to thank the note takers, Hannah Wilson, Hannah Marie Garcia, Natalie Menacci, Edie Mari, Addie Norgard, who have helped over the last few sessions, and Esther Kennedy, who diligently took notes and reported out for all the sessions. I would also like to thank the Ocean Acidification Network Executive Committee. A lot of planning meetings go into something like this, and these are all committed people that are contributing to the network in really big ways on top of their existing work. And I also want to thank Molly, who helped us set up this structure and has been a constant source of positive energy to keep us on track, and in the most kind ways get us back on track when we got off track. So my last slide, I think, just pointing to available resources through the network. We hope you'll check them out. All of these have been produced through collaborations with network members. And there's a website link at the bottom, and we're about to launch a new website in the next 2 weeks. The cover is going to look like that. And it will have the information it currently does, plus specific pages for each region across the state and each species. So we'll be providing more content in this next phase of the website. So we hope you'll check it out. Thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to working with all of you into the future.
And how about everyone practice using your reactions? A big hearty hand to Darcy for all of her leadership in organizing this. Also, thank you, Darcy, so much for everything that you've done to help make this happen. And thanks, everyone.
All right.